All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and kick off our next panel with a little bit of pessimism now, as Blake Reed, one of the clinical faculty here at Silicon Flatirons, leads a panel on technology's perils and pitfalls. So, Blake, take it away.
Thanks, Connor, and hello, everyone. Good morning. Again, echoing the thanks of the moderators before for making it out in the snow today. Okay, so we talked in the Optimism panel about climate change, 80 years of cars maiming people, and the destruction of democracy by social media. And now we're going to talk about the negative consequences of technology. So I know folks are hoping we're going to secretly turn the pessimism panel into an optimism discussion, but no, it's going to get worse. And then this afternoon, we're going to have a debate about really whether technology is literally destroying democracy. Okay, to help me tee this all up, I will refer you to the program for their long bios, but I just want to welcome Britton Heller from Foley Hoag, who specializes in advising companies on privacy, freedom of expression, content moderation, and so forth. Dave Moss from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who is a muckraker and noisemaker, focuses on police surveillance, free speech, transparency, and government accountability. Francella Ochillo from Next Century Cities, who's a leader in technology policy and consumer advocacy around broadband, which we're going to talk about a little bit in this panel. Jamie Tomasello, who is the head of trust and compliance at Duo Security. She is a multidisciplinary technologist who considers privacy, security, and trust to be ways of life rather than checkbox exercises. And last but not least, Richard Witt, who is a corporate strategist and technology policy attorney, an 11-year veteran at Google, where he served as the director for strategic initiatives. Okay, so we're going to interrogate pessimism. What do we mean by that? What are the ways in which technologies have created overt problems? What are the ways in which technologies have failed to deliver on their promised benefits? We'll think about some predictive frames. What are the terrible things that could happen as a result of the deployment of technology? And so to help tease this out, I'm going to ask each panelist to start with a case study, or maybe two or three, that identifies a technology where some of these problems have arisen. Then we'll turn to trying to unpack what common threads and root causes underlie the problems. And maybe if everyone is super well behaved, we'll talk about whether we can do something to fix them, or maybe not. Okay, Britton, go for it.
I'm going to tell you a few stories today with anonymized names until the end. We're good? All right. There was a young woman in Washington, D.C. by the name of Noor. She lived in Virginia. She worked in the district. She was, around the time of the Women's March and the inaugural marches, she was accused of setting a Trump supporter's hair on fire during a march. There were pictures that showed up online of a woman who kind of facially resembled Noor doing that, taking a lighter and lighting the braid of another protester. Only this wasn't Noor. It was somebody who had some physical attributes the same, a similar hair color, similar skin tone. She was actually visiting her father in hospice care in Virginia. Through crowdsourcing on 4chan and 8chan, somebody identified her as the person who had set the braids on fire. It then went more mainstream. It started there and then moved to Reddit and then moved to other websites that were promoting vigilante justice. She started getting calls to her work. She started getting lots of personal abuse to her cell phone, to her email address. Cars started showing up in front of her home. The content of this material was racist, sexist, anti-Muslim. It called her a terrorist. It called her a bitch. It called her all the names that you can probably think of. And law enforcement was not sympathetic. They told her that there was nothing that they could really do to help in her situation. I was one of the advocates who took on Noor's situation, and we basically had to compile a case like I was still a prosecutor at the Department of Justice to prove through pictures that showed that she was at her sick father's bedside, through other location-based information to show that she and her family were in the hotel that they had to move into because they couldn't stay safely in their house anymore. And we had to go to the police to say, if you don't do anything about this situation, you're going to be aggravating the harm. And we understand that this is not typical protocol, but you need to do something. Noor is not alone. This is the story of Julie. Julie is a political journalist. She found herself covering the 2016 presidential election and was very excited about it until she figured out she had to use Twitter. On Twitter, she found herself inundated with anti-Semitic tweets. And I'm not talking 1 or 2 or 100. I'm talking about thousands. And these showed pictures of her superimposed in concentration camps, inside a gas chamber with then-candidate Trump pushing the button. She received so many of these threats that she actually went out and bought herself a firearm. The abuse moved from online content to offline harassment when she received a call from a coffin maker asking her what size, where the child-sized coffin that had been ordered in her family's name should be delivered. The final story is about an advocate named Britton Heller, who found herself swatted. At her home, somebody spoofed a call to the police, pretending to be her partner, and said, "Hello, my name is blank. I work at this company. I have shot my wife with an assault rifle. I have tied up our children. I have placed pipe bombs all over our neighborhood, and I will shoot any officer on sight who attempts to approach me. Have a lovely day." I was on a flight at this time, and my partner was at home alone. We don't have any children yet, and so when the police came and broke down the door, they asked him where were the children, and he said, they're not here. Well, where is your wife? She's not here. There were 40 police cars, 4 fire engines, helicopters, the bomb squad, the SWAT team, plainclothes police officers who cordoned off all of the neighborhood. It was probably the biggest police action that our town had ever seen. And it was designed to teach both my partner and I a lesson for the type of work that I'd been doing, speaking out against white supremacy and online harassment. So what does this teach us about the internet? If you look at hate speech and harassment, new studies show that it's the same level today as it was during the election. And this seems really counterintuitive to people because they thought that there were spikes, but the baseline level remains the same, and this is pretty damn pessimistic. It's now tied into other vectors that I'm sure my other panelists will talk about, like disinformation, electoral interference, and is being integrally integrated with legitimate political expression. So it's harder to separate. And this is an intentional technique by the people who promote these type of activities. There is a proliferation of harassment online. The challenge is that we don't actually know what this looks like in practice, because people who try to study this quantify harassment using different terminology and different behaviors as their metrics. And this is a failing of some of the very well-meaning advocacy groups who just can't get their stuff together. Harassment is also the testing ground and the vocabulary for digital authoritarians. It's not just an American phenomenon. So if you look around the world, especially to Southeast Asia and Africa, you get a preview about what's going to come. And you're already starting to see it in American political milieus. Finally, there's a risk of mass violence and a rise in xenophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim behavior, and misogyny. The risk here is that companies and regulators are taking action that is primarily reactive and not proactive. The other major risk is discounting the ties between words and action. That is my pessimism for you, and happy to take questions afterwards.
So, Britton, before I move on to Dave, one thing that I think was implicit in all the stories was the role of technology. You didn't surface explicitly exactly what technology was there in each of those. You want to say just a quick word about that before I hand off to Dave?
A lot of the technology used to implement these type of harms, it's generally available apps. This is not secret squirrel stuff. These are things. These are things that are readily available online. I have an app called My Talking Pet, and it can make my cat sing Beach Boys songs, but it can also be used to make me say things that I probably wouldn't say in normal life.
Dave, turn to you.
Sure. So my name is Dave, and I investigate police surveillance at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. But oftentimes it takes me a very long time to explain how the technology works before I can even get into the problems with it. And so today I want to talk about, start with a little bit of a simpler issue that everyone can understand, and that is potholes and vandalism. And a story that came up about 10 years ago when I was a reporter, and this was kind of the beginning of when city governments were saying, open data is great, civic innovation is great, let's start trying everything we can to improve technology to provide services to the public. And so in the city of San Diego, the Public Works Department had a website where you could go online and report a pothole, report graffiti, and then Public Works would dispatch somebody to go fix it. But there was a city council member who was going to run for mayor, and he wanted to establish a reputation as a digital innovator. He tried to work with the city to develop an app. The city has a long, has anybody worked in local government before? It's a very long process to approve something like that. And so he decided, well, I've got this discretionary fund for my city council office, so why don't I just pay an app developer to make an app that allows you to report from your phone whenever you see a pothole or graffiti, and then that will go to the Public Works Department. And so he did. He paid for it. He negotiated it down from a $35,000 project to a $10,000 project. And he did a huge publicity campaign, went on TV, went on the radio, everything. And then, it went out into the world. And now I want to tell you about an individual named Citizen 52296. A year after this app was out, as a reporter, I started looking into this app. And it turned out that a full 25% of the 3,500 complaints that went through this system came from about a 4-block area in a very upscale neighborhood. And once we dug into it a little bit more, it turns out there's just one guy who's a retiree who was just using it every day between getting up, waking up in the morning and then going to the gym. And he would document every pothole, and he would document every piece of graffiti. He thought it was his civic duty to do that. He wanted to improve the city. But back at the Public Works Department, who had not been involved in the development of the app, their sort of program was they deal with things as a first come, first serve. As complaints come in, they deal with it. And so as a result, because he was filing maybe 75, 80 of these in a week, and then the rest of the city was maybe filing a few dozen, all of the resources were going to this few blocks in the city. And nobody was communicating with each other, and nobody understood what was going on. But as a result, everybody else, one guy was being served very well. The politician had gotten a great round of press on it, but everybody else in the city was seeing a lack of services. And I think that if you look at this sort of problem, where people are involved in technology, are pursuing their self-interest, everybody is asking, what problems can we solve with this, but not asking what problems can we cause with this, you end up with everybody who's not involved in the process losing out. And I talk about this with potholes and vandalism, but if we move up and we look at higher stake things in the criminal justice system, things that can result in people getting shot, people ending up in jail inappropriately, people not being released from jail in a timely fashion, you can start to see that if people are only hearing marketing pitches, are only pursuing things to get elected the next time around, we're just going to create more problems that affect all of society.
So we've heard thus far about the malicious misuse of technology, the unexpected use of technology in problematic ways. Francella, I know you're going to tell us about failure to deploy technology in the way it needs to be. I'll turn to you.
Yeah. Well, first, thank you so much for organizing this conversation, and especially to Amy and her team and people like Connor and all of the students who really have made this a seamless process. I think whenever I go to some of these conferences, my concern is always when people walk out of the room, what did you do with what you got here? And the truth of the matter is that a lot of people in Washington, D.C. who are thinking through these problems are thinking through the problems of the people in their networks when really they're trying to solve problems for people who have no agency and have no way to get their voices into the halls of Washington, D.C. And when I think about even things that remind me of why we do what we do, I think also specifically about a student that I met. It was about a year after I started doing this work, and I was brought to someone actually told the student to contact me just to find out about some opportunities to get a job in tech policy. And I remember in just a conversation I was asking about how did they end up in their program at a certain university. And she told me she came from a rural place in California where essentially it's a ton of immigrant families where most people don't have access to the internet. And that her dad used to take off from the farm, from the fields, every other Friday to take them to Bakersfield where they could use a library. And she is the oldest in her family. None of them have had a college education. And the truth is that I don't know that they even expected her to get one. So she gets into this program, and she's applying for jobs, and she finally gets an offer. And she calls me, and this is a year later, and she says, can you help me with something really sensitive? She said, I got an offer letter, but no one in my family's ever gotten one before, so I don't know what to ask for or if this is even a good offer. And I think that one thing that highlights is that this isn't just an issue about whether or not people actually get access to technology. This is not just about can we get the infrastructure to their neighborhoods? Can we find a way to teach them how to use it? We are creating this culture where we're going to have people who are digital natives competing with people who are digital prophytes. And essentially, the people who are prophytes will never be able to catch up with the people who are digital natives. The people who are natives will always be able to speak that language fluently. They'll always have different opportunities. They'll always have higher home values, higher salaries, be able to have economic mobility in a way that communities who are disconnected will not have opportunities to do so. And so when I think about that student who, essentially made it out of Lost Hills, California, one of the things that always resonates with me is that I said, how many houses were in your town? And she said, well, there were only around 40 houses. And I said, well, how many of you actually went on to college? And she said, well, I got out. And the way that she actually framed it, that I got out, it scares me because then that means there are 39 other households where we don't know what happened to those kids. And I think that sometimes it's important to humanize these stories, that these are not just case studies, because very often the people who are in the rooms who are making decisions have lots of different ways to get connected. You have lots of different ways to actually complain about a process or to demand change or to organize or to actually seek some sort of redress, while the people who have no access essentially are yelling into these places where essentially no one can hear their voices. And I think that when we're talking about changes for policy, if we're really serious about changing policy, I think all the time about, I'm working on a paper right now about thinking about how when Eisenhower decided he wanted to have an interstate system of highways and actually decided back in the 50s, we're gonna invest over $100 billion into creating an interstate highway system. The federal government's gonna pay for over 90% of what it's gonna take to get those roads into every single state, not only for defense, but also for economic prosperity for the country. And there was actually a decision to actually invest in these communities. And I think that obviously there was a lot of fallout about obviously like reclaiming certain lands and going through certain places. So it's not that it's done without any sort of bruises. But I think that the commitment was there to say that we want to make sure that everyone can connect in a seamless way. And so when I think about right now, when we're thinking about all of our aspirational goals as a country, whether you're talking about upskilling your workforce, improving educational outcomes, making sure that people have access to telehealth initiatives, all of these things are based on the fundamental principle that everyone actually has some sort of access to the place where we're all speaking the same fluent digital language. So I'd never want this to be lost when we're talking about things at this macro level and talking about policy solutions, because the truth of the matter is the people in the rooms who are making a lot of these decisions don't usually look like me. They don't usually get packaged like me. They don't usually come from places where I'm a first-generation immigrant. We did not have a lot of money to spare. A lot of the people who are making these decisions come from very different socioeconomic backgrounds and are quite satisfied with the people who are in the room. So I encourage, especially every single person in this room, to really think about what levers of power do you have to start bringing new people into these conversations, to start solving these problems, especially about access, in a way that we haven't had the courage to do so before.
So, Francella, before we move on, I wanted to ask you, and we're going to get into this with the full panel in just a minute, about root causes. And what do you see at the core of the divide between digital natives and digital prophytes that you're describing? Do you see technology as having a role? Do you see this as a broader set of economic issues? What's at the root of it?
I think that technology is more of a symptom, because the truth of the matter is that as it emerges, I truthfully believe like our policies reflect our values. And one thing I want to disclaim is that many of the things that I'll say today do not reflect the values of our Next Century Cities members. These are things that I've collected either in my own research or in my work before the organization, because quite frankly, even though like even Boulder, Colorado is a Next Century Cities member, they might not take a position on some of these issues. But I think that one thing that's really important when we're talking about tech access and we're talking about who's getting to actually resolve some of the problems that are emerging, I think that we need to think really carefully about who's in the room when we're designing some of the things that are actually problematic. And once we identify that it's a problem, who did we actually tap to come in and craft solutions? Because very often, if we were to say, for example, we have over anywhere from the FCC's estimates to being around 20 million people who are disconnected up to over 100 million by private estimates. If in that number, it's over 50% of people living on tribal lands are included in those groups. People who are senior citizens are very likely living on fixed incomes at 40,000 or under are very likely to be in those groups. The disabled or even communities of color who usually rely on their cell phone for access. When we look at what all of those people have in common, if you are low income in this country or in a rural area that is hard to reach, you are probably among the group of people who are disconnected. And the truth of the matter is, if our policies said that we think that every single person in the United States should have access to a digital society, then I think that we'd have a very different outcome. But that's not what our policies say. Our policies do reward people who are able to afford access. And so I think that we need to think carefully as a society that even if it's a de facto policy, it wasn't intentional, it's just that this is how it's essentially evolved, I think that we need to think carefully about, okay, so now we know it's a problem. So what did we do to actually bring in new voices to solve that problem? Because when we're talking about issues, whether it's digital equity or digital inclusion, if we know that the group that is most affected by being disconnected are people who are in indigenous communities who are living on tribal lands, I have very rarely gone to a digital equity or inclusion summit and actually seen an indigenous person advocate there. So I think that it's about being intentional about who we're including in these conversations and not just talking about people, but actually solving problems with the people who are affected.
So, Jamie, I want to turn to you now. We heard reference to who's in the room at the time of design, and I know your examples will circulate around the role of design.
Yeah, absolutely. So across the course of my career, although at this point in time I'm the head of trust and compliance at Duo Security, I've worked in trust and safety and head technology roles and information security and risk and compliance for law firms, for nonprofits, for internet and ISPs. So I've had different types of experiences and seen different types of challenges and how they're presented. And one of the things that I've heard a little bit, or in the earlier panel, around trying to get technologists to understand the values or to be teaching values as part of the university and ethics and things of that nature. But I think we need to kind of take a step back a little bit and even say, like, some of the failures that are in design of some of these systems and these applications are really due to a lack of inclusion, more than just a lack of understanding values. And when we talk about a lack of inclusion, I mean, this is a lack of not just inclusion, but a lack of representation, because as Fertilla said, like, we code our own values within policy, but we also do it in the actual literal code that engineers write. And a couple of I would say, examples of where I've seen some of this is when you hear people talk about sort of the user persona. They are designing for themselves, or they're designing for their mom or their grandmother. They're like, oh, when my grandmother's using this. But rarely do you hear an example of either a threat model or a user persona that is a user that comes from an indigenous group or from the global south for global companies, and really thinking about how these users may utilize the product differently because they have different user experiences and different life experiences, and thusly they're literally going to use that product in a different way, which also means their threat models are different, and the folks that intend to abuse the product is different. So as we think about some of the security testing protocols that you would go through to ensure that the product is safe and secure, as we would expect from an application security or information security perspective, we also need to reflect back on some of the things that Ashkan Soltani said back at Enigma around abusability, and really thinking about how could users or indirect external folks exploit this tech to harm others, or harm the world, whether it is harm other users within a platform or just harm users full stop utilizing this technology. Another thing that I've also seen in the course of the work that I've done is something really tactical around the abuse reporting process. So some of you may be familiar with, in trust and safety, when you want to report abusive content or abusive activities or abusive behaviors. And a lot of different applications or platforms or technologies develop an abuse team or a trust and safety team after the product has been launched, and not as a part of how are we dealing with this as a risk management issue. Or it comes off of the customer service team, like, oh, the customer service team has received a lot of complaints, so we need to have an abuse team now to handle these issues. And some of the things that we've seen is the abuse of that abuse reporting process has been used to silence speech. We have seen it disrupt social activism through the use of utilizing DMCA complaints, through standard just high volume abuse complaints. Specifically when there's, especially grassroots organization during key social activism events, it is extremely impactful when, whether it's, a false abuse complaint or a high volume abuse complaint comes in and it causes an event page or a website or whatever it may be, whatever that channel may be that's being used to be temporarily suspended, then there's no longer that community. And that organization, not only does it disrupt that immediate event, but it also undermines the trust that those community organizers have. And that's extremely problematic. And then obviously, the pure speech component, that if, an oppositional force does not like what you're having to say, then utilizing abuse processes to take it down, whether it's warranted or not. And these are the types of things that companies need to be thinking about on how can these, not just the technology, but the policies and processes that they have in place can be used to harm others.
Rick, turn to you. So we've now heard the notion that we're not thinking carefully enough about how products are not just going to be used, but misused. Where do you see that materializing in artificial intelligence?
Sure, Blake, and I think I wanted to take a step back on the spot here and suggest a framing for the pessimism, which comes from a quote from E.O. Wilson about 10 years ago now, in which he talks about the human dilemma, which is the notion that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technologies. And one of my concerns is that we focus so much on the technologies, we tend to overlook the very human and institutional dimensions behind them. And on the previous panel, climate change was brought up as an example of something which, while a huge issue for us as a species, is something we can fix. But frankly, it's a symptom of many other things that are wrong with our relationship with our planet, from the microplastics in our bodies to species disappearing every day, right? Those are the human and institutional dimensions of something that we all too readily decide are just a technology issue that needs to be addressed through technology means. So shifting to the online world, the so-called computational systems, which it includes the data that's comprised of us, the AI and machine learning systems, which are the technologies behind the scenes, sort of the nervous system, and then the sensors and devices and that are online, but increasingly in our environment, which are the sensory systems of this sort of organism. Behind the scenes, there are humans and institutions making decisions every day about how those technologies are deployed, how the data is extracted, collected, analyzed, and in turn increasingly used not just to sort of profile us, but to actually influence our behavior. And so I think, again, if we miss that human dimension, I feel like we're missing a large part of the picture. And the one piece I wanted to touch on, which I think addresses some of the points that came up in some of the earlier parts of the conversation here, is what I consider the failings of the user paradigm. The idea that we are users of these technologies online, whether it's the web or the internet, or we're now users walking down the street in an IoT environment, we are sort of passive recipients of whatever happens to be there, right? And these are largely one-way transactional setups as opposed to ongoing relationships. A few examples I have as to why I think this is the case is ask yourself if you want to sort of step back and walk away. If you want to say, I want to exercise my right to lack of consent, whether it's under GDPR or the California Act or other things, basically opt out of being part of this world, I can do that. That is agency I have. Except if you sort of think about it for a moment, that's not really the case, right? First off, there are great services that Facebook and Google and Amazon and many other platforms provide that we have a hard time walking away from. Even when Facebook had to deal with some of the big challenges as a result of Cambridge Analytica, relatively few people disconnected from Facebook. They may have used them a bit less, but over time that sort of built back up again and they continue gaining new users. Second, once you opt out of this system, you lack the ability, therefore, to have any ability to sort of shape what happens in the system, right? You sort of have lost leverage. You're now an outsider, a bystander, and not have the agency, again, to sort of come in and try to make things better. Third, as we've seen with the consent fatigue that results from something like GDPR, most of us undergo the same behavior we had before. We just get more and more of the click-throughs. Yes, yes, I agree. I want to see my free cat videos and move on. And that's just the way it is. We just get more of them. But the notion, the human dimension, again, the understanding that psychologically, most of us want what we want at that moment. We've been trained in some ways by the web to basically agree to that exchange of data for services that we find useful, at least in the moment. Fourth, even if we choose to opt out, right, we have people, our family, our friends, who can keep us opted in. They can keep tagging us on Facebook. They can keep posting content. They can even post their own DNA content online. And that DNA, of course, has an implication for me if I'm a family member. So there's this notion increasingly, this is a shared collective experience, not just this notion of the hyper-individual, I can stand alone and this no longer affects me. A few other ideas quickly is in the situations, as I mentioned, IoT, whether you're walking down the street, whether you have a Clearview facial recognition profile online, which was scraped from photos that were not photos I put online. They were photos that were there on websites, maybe gathered by others, but there was no initial opt-in by me for those photographs to be there, but now those images are there. They're now being used to profile me, whether or not I have any recourse over that. Then you have things like the Amazon Ring doorbell, which is protecting somebody, which is great in their house, except it's also looking at my house 24/7 across the street and whatever may be happening there that I may or may not want the entire world to know about. So there are other examples of that we can go into as part of the conversation, but the larger point is this is not an opt-in, opt-out dichotomy anymore. We can't just simply say we can walk away from the dumpster fire, as someone has commented, that Facebook and others have created online. This is something we all have to own as individuals and as parts of society, but that makes both the challenges and the potential upside all the greater if we can somehow figure it out. Thanks.
So Rick, I want to take your provocation, which I think tees off of something Francella said earlier about technology just being a symptom of the problems that we're dealing with here, and you've made the case that we're dealing with fundamentally human problems here, and maybe heard the notion of technology just holding a mirror up to society. I think I saw a Casey tweet earlier that technology is helping us find all of the things that we don't like about each other. What's everyone's reaction to that? And I'll throw that open as a jump ball. And I'll cold call you if I have to. Dave, you want to take this one?
So just to make sure I understand. So the idea is talking about what we're learning about ourselves through technology and the negative things we're learning about ourselves.
Yeah. So is technology, as we're exploring all of these problems that we've laid out on the table, is it just reflecting things that were problems about us all along, or problems that we personally are causing, or is there something that technology is adding new to the mix?
Okay, so there's this term when I'm looking at law enforcement surveillance, there's this term that police like to use called the technology is a, quote, force multiplier. Mm-hmm. That the idea that the technology is not doing anything different than what we were doing before, but it's just allowing us to do it more efficiently on a greater scale. So, for example, there's a technology called license plate readers, which are these technologies that take pictures of your car's license plate, attach the time, date, and geolocation of it to create a database of where everybody's cars are all the time. And police will say, well, this is not any different than when we have somebody on a stakeout and they're just sitting outside a place writing down where the license plates are and writing them down in a notebook. So we're just doing that on a larger scale. It's not anything different. The privacy level isn't any different. But to me, I think about it in terms of, well, a city might have 150 of these cameras all around, and if I think the population saw a police department on every corner, a police officer on every corner writing down their license plates, they would find that intolerable. They would find that creepy. And so I think that a lot of these technologies, there had been a check and balance based on finances that is sort of unspoken. That we only have certain many amount of police officers who can be doing crime, investigations. We only have a helicopter that we can put up, once a week because it's so expensive. But you start getting drones, and we can put them up all the time. So I do think that technology is actually taking things that people think it's just, this is just no different than it was before, but it's just making it so much worse because nobody's taking into account how expanding the existing problems or making them more efficient may actually cause more damage to society.
Let me go to Fran and then to Rick.
And
Rick,
you said something interesting about it being a force multiplier, and I think a lot about if we're acknowledging that technology encodes systems of power. That means that if it amplifies power and you are sitting in a position of power, then you are even more powerful. And for those who are disenfranchised, essentially you are either the same or essentially there's no way for you to combat all of these people who have exponentially more power than you. So the issue is that as long as we have this gap in between those who are connected and those who are disconnected, the ones who have more power will always have exponentially more. And so what concerns me is the fact that, again, if our policies reflect our values and we're saying if you're disconnected, essentially you're on your own, good luck to you, we wish you the best, and the people who are even more powerful continue to climb this ladder, essentially you have these large populations of people who are never able to actually jump that gap. And even when I think about something, when I think about people who are enfranchised by either technology or media, I think back to something that I was going to mention to you, Blake, about the Disabilities Act. And it was, for a long time, people with disabilities had demonstrated in the United States asking for more rights. And essentially until really the turn of the 19th century, it was seen as an act of charity for any sort of municipality to make an accommodation for people with disabilities. It wasn't until around, I think it was like the 70s and the 80s, where people were essentially like, we are literally going to protest. And one thing that made that protest in 77 really ugly was the fact that they had people in wheelchairs literally putting themselves in front of buses in federal agency buildings and all sorts of places. And that's what essentially laid the groundwork for the American Disabilities Act that happened maybe like 15 years later, or maybe in around 1990, when essentially that made it a requirement for every single entity, business, everybody to make it accessible for people with disabilities to get onto a sidewalk, and that's why we have a divot on the side of the sidewalk, or maybe to get into a building with a ramp. And all of those changes were made essentially because people literally said, this is a civil rights issue, you're not going to ignore us. And part of what actually activated change was because there were these pictures and videos that people could no longer ignore. And so when I think a lot about this, I'm thinking about what is it going to take for the people who essentially we're acknowledging are not in positions of power. What is it going to take for them to yell and scream and demonstrate? Because the truth is, as much as Richard brought up a point about like we can't opt in and opt out of this technology, for a lot of the people who are disenfranchised, not only do they not have a choice of opting in and opting out, they are stuck with the consequences of whatever belief system you guys are coming up with when you actually do have access. So for the people who are having conversations on Facebook or other platforms, whatever those beliefs that people have about those disenfranchised people, those beliefs are being hardened in conversations where they are completely excluded. So the thing is, those people who are disconnected, they not only don't have a choice, but they're going to be stuck with whatever those consequences are. And so I just, again, feel like it's so important to humanize this story, because the truth is, a lot of people in this room might not actually know someone who's completely disconnected, but I think a lot about the fact that if it were our own children or a family member or people who were just stuck in places where no one could hear their voice or their cries for help, we would treat this with a different level of urgency.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that last point, when I was suggesting sort of opt in and opt out, that also includes people who have no ability to opt in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. So, and one of the points I think that's very well taken from Vagella is these, whether or not you're part of the system, whether by choice or because you have no access in the first place, these things are happening around you. Your society is being formed every day by thousands and millions of transactions happening online, where all the, and as a result, democracy may be in peril, news reporting may be disappearing, the overall social discourse is coarsening, and this is happening whether or not you're involved. And again, this is whether you're opting out or opting in based on choice or because you just don't have the access in the first place. But getting back to the question about whether technology is making things worse, one of the original premises of the web was it gives everybody a chance to have speech. We all have an equal right to come online once we have access, to be able to raise our voices and talk about things that are important to us, to create communities of interest around these things. The challenge now we're seeing with the web, and particularly with the business models of companies like my own former company, Google and Facebook, is that now you're taking the speech and now you're taking what people have now called the reach. You're enhancing, using algorithms, recommendation engines, et cetera, to take the things that create most engagement, which creates the most money, and those are the things that tend to then to get exacerbated, exaggerated. Mm-hmm. And so what has become, at least in so many ways, problematic in terms of there's sort of equal amounts of speech around, now the truly, I think, disturbing aspects of speech are being elevated by the platforms because it serves their particular pecuniary interests. And that's, I think, where a good example where technology as currently instantiated is really making things that much worse.
Britton, can I loop you in on that point? I think your examples circled around this idea of technology amplifying some of the worst impulses that people might have.
Yeah, I think Richard covered it very well, where I was also going to talk about how an engagement-based business model will necessarily amplify people at the fringes and take people at the fringes and push them farther and farther and farther away. And I think until until you can find a new model to measure success rather than the reach or rather than the number of clicks, then it's going to be increasingly difficult for these companies to, one, monetize their activity, and two, promote the type of content that 99% of their users really want to see.
Jamie, invite you in here.
Yeah, there's so many things that both Richard and Britton said that I was going to say, and I agree with. Ultimately, I think technology is amplifying systemic bias. And I heard earlier around like, oh, I'm worried about the bias of the data set. I'm actually more concerned about the bias that's being coded into the algorithms, which skews whatever data you put in, which is also skewed. So it's a combination of both. In conjunction with that engagement that you're speaking to, of like, well, the financial incentives are on the edges, on the fringes, and when you have that all together, you're really just amplifying this, and it's just moving so much more quickly. And there's that lack of transparency, as Dave said. You could see if there's a police officer or if there are these cameras or these things, but if you are somebody who can't see that or doesn't know about it or just isn't exposed to that technology, then you don't even know what is happening and acting upon you.
So, Francel, I want to take a provocation that you raised and tie back to the last panel. Part of this debate over optimism and pessimism is about whether on net technology is empowering people more than it is harming them, whether the ability to engage, whether with policymakers or socially or culturally or economically or whatever other sense, is outweighing the problems that we've talked about today. And I was thinking about, as you mentioned, the ADA, the Deaf President movement that happened at Gallaudet University in 1988, 1989, where students at Gallaudet University were able to leverage a pretty tremendous amount of change to say, we really need a new president who's actually deaf that represents our interests, in part because they were in Washington, D.C., and they were able to march down to the Capitol and sort of occupy and be in the face of policymakers. We've seen some diffusion happen as a result of the technological developments in the last 20 years. And so I wonder how folks think about whether, again, advocacy, cultural, economic, the benefits that have resulted from technology, if those are outweighing or maybe outweighed by some of the problems we're talking about.
I think that there's a lot of good that comes with access. And to me, I feel like your opportunities are actually directly proportional to your amount of digital access. So the thing is, if we are acknowledging that in a digital society, even to open a bank account, you need an email address. To sign up for your health care, you need to be able to get online. When you go to the doctor, they send you your x-rays via email. There are so many places where essentially, if you don't have access, it makes it a little bit more difficult. I remember when I ran into someone who, he said that he took the day off of work to renew his driver's license. That's something that cost me $20 online that I can do in 10 minutes when I go onto DC's DMV website. But for him, he's an hourly employee. He took the time off of work. He had to take the bus because he doesn't have any other transportation. He takes all of that time off work, goes down to the DMV, waits half of the day, gets his license renewed. So the thing is, something that could have been a $20 process for me, where I could have actually afforded to pay more, essentially was more of a $100 process for him. And so the thing is, I just want to make sure that we're thinking about what that feels like to be on the other side of this conversation. And also when we're thinking about all of the good that it does, just because we're acknowledging that there are some things that we should be mindful of doesn't discount all of the good. There are lots of things and a lot of outcomes that have changed by lots of different populations actually having access, but that doesn't change the fact that I worry about how do we think about surveillance and the idea that we're going to be the first generations where you essentially have people who are under surveillance of lots of different kinds for their entire lifetime. And what does that mean? And when we talk about smart cities and having all of these new applications, when you have people collecting hordes of data that they don't even know what to do with. Essentially, there's going to have to be a third party who comes in and says, we got this great business model. We're going to start turning this data that we're collecting into some sort of currency. That worries me because the truth is, we know that we don't know how to manage that right now, and there aren't a lot of guardrails on how information is either collected, managed, stored. So essentially, these are just things that I think that it's important to keep on the radar, because it's just, I think that it would be short-sighted to say there's all of this good that it's doing, when 20 years from now, I think that we're gonna look back and ask really hard questions about what did we do when we had the opportunity to demand more.
Dave, Britton, want to open up to you, having started the hour with some pretty pessimistic examples. Where do you stand on this question of benefits versus harms?
I mean, there are things that I really like about technology, and there's always a kind of duality about it. What comes to mind is this website called Muckrock, which makes it a lot easier for regular people to file Freedom of Information Act requests. And I remember when I first filed my first Freedom of Information request, like about 12, 13 years ago, there wasn't a lot of people to ask about it, and there wasn't a lot of people doing it. But now you go online and you see there's a whole community of people who believe in government transparency. They are filing these requests all the time, and this is resulting in government being more open, and we're finding more scandals, and we're holding people accountable. On the flip side, government is going to say that Muckrock is terrible, because it makes our jobs so much harder, and there's so many more gadflies who are harassing us with these vexatious requests. So, I do think it's a mix, and I do find that there's some useful stuff. Another sort of internal contradiction for me is, so I'm really into virtual reality, and I have some students I work with, and one of the things I have students do is go use Google Earth in virtual reality, which is just the most amazing, crazy thing. Like, you can just see the world and never leave. And a lot of my students are from rural Nevada, and they have not traveled ever before. And yet, at the same time, this is Google indexing the entire country, entire world, and that's creepy as well. And so I do try to look for things.
It is a little bit.
Yeah, so I do try to look for things that, I try to look at the methods that I'm really worried about, and seeing how we can, flip them and use them to educate people and hold power accountable.
Britton, turn to you, and then I'll go to Jamie and Richard for the last word.
I'm actually a tempered optimist. Don't tell anyone, but
It's on Twitter already.
it's shoot. I think we're in the awkward adolescence of the internet. And if you look at the span of technological development, people had similar worries about the telegraph and the telephone and the television, and we're there now. And it looks like we're at the cusp of regulation and legislation, and so maybe the challenge is now how to do it in a smart way, in a way that integrates freedom of expression, human rights, and public safety, and pushes us all forward together.
Well, I want to just add one more thing now that Britton's made me think about it. So I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a pessimist either, but more of a skeptic. And I really promote skepticism rather than let's just talk in glowing terms and the miracles of what technology can do, but really interrogating it. What could go wrong here? What are the risks? What are the threats? And asking that at the very onset of any planning.
That's exactly right. So a lot of the work I do now is I do human rights impact assessments for companies and for products and for services. So people are starting to think about this proactively in a way that I didn't see even 2 or 3 years ago. And thinking about corporate social responsibility, not in a way that is related to public relations or philanthropy, but looking at it as a core business function. And to me, that is one of the main differences that I think is going to make things better going forward.
Amy.
So from my perspective, it's not being an optimist or a pessimist. It's just being a realist. Just, it is what it is to me. And I think there are things that you can do, that we can do to improve it. I don't think, you want to just be like, it's all golden, shiny, happy, hooray, and that's one option. Or it's the worst thing that's ever happened to us. We don't live, I don't live in that binary world. And so from my perspective, it really is about, and maybe this is also my bias of being in risk and compliance as well. Okay, so how do we assess risk? How are we addressing the true problems that we need to solve? How are we treating causes and not symptoms, and really unpacking what those underlying things are so that we're working from a place of truth and not from logical fallacies or faulty assumptions. And I think from that point, you move forward.
I agree with pretty much all of that. I'm not sure what label to give it. I guess my thought is we should really push back against the user paradigm, which we believe is with us forever, but really only been here for roughly 20 years on the web. And it may have worked back in the 60s and 70s and early 80s when they had computer scientists going back and forth over the web, but this is a very different era. And one of the ironies I've seen is that when we had the web come on board back in roughly the 2000s, when most of the United States started coming on board with it anyway, the notion was we're going to get rid of all those intermediaries, right? All those folks who create friction, they slow us down, they don't really provide a whole lot of value. And then we had web companies come in and sort of take their place. But the irony to me is that many of those companies that they're replacing had some sort of actual relationship with people. Maybe you were a customer, maybe even a client. And we've gotten away from that. We've gotten away from the basics of what the fiduciary duties of care, duties of loyalty, things that go back hundreds of years in the common law, but for some reason we've completely forgotten about. And in the marketplace of tomorrow, I would love to see a world, and I'm working on some of that as part of my project with GliaNet, as part of the Mozilla Foundation, is to create a world where we have new intermediaries, fiduciaries who represent our interests, and puts the power back on our side, that we, in fact, can use these intermediaries and cool tech tools like personal AIs that interact in real time with Alexa and Google Assistant, identity layers that we control, data that stays hyper-local, local cloudlets so the computation moves to me rather than sitting on an Equifax server 24/7, taking the existing paradigm where we are sort of the passive side of the platform and writing that power balance by giving us both the agency using entities that will represent us and then the tech tools that give us that ability to push back and to really represent our interests in ways that not just protect us, but actually promote us maybe as actual real human beings. So that's sort of the vision, I think, the optimistic vision I take from where we are, is to try to think through where the systemic problems are happening from being human beings and institutions with these godlike technologies, and how do we try to shift things around so that we're more in the driver's seat going forward.
All right, so we've started to close on way too optimistic and solution-oriented a note. I have to cut us off here. But I do want to make a plug for tomorrow morning. We're going to do our panels tomorrow morning that are going to be specifically focused on solutions, so please do come back tomorrow for those. I'm going to take our last about 12 minutes here and open it up to the audience for questions. And as always, I'm going to turn to a student first. And the first person I saw when I looked up that has the microphone is Kelsey. So does anyone want to save Kelsey from being on call? This is,
Nice.
Did I see a hand up?
I'm always ready to ask a question, Blake.
Jordan, go for it.
Jordan Rosenham at 3L here at the law school. So you all talked a lot about very real harms that impact us every day. And we all know that whenever humans are involved, there will be pitfalls and unintended consequences to our actions. But for the sake of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, how do we know when we've done enough to think of inclusion, to think of giving access, and to think of those potential harms? Really, how do we know when we should put our product out there? Are there boxes to check, or do you have general guidelines that people can follow?
Jump all to the panel.
I'll jump in. I think the first question asked is, did you even start? And I think that's really important to make sure, like, have you done this? And I think also coming from the place of, to quote Kim Creighton, tech is not neutral. And I think if we're coming from the perspective of, instead of saying tech is neutral and working from there, start with the assumption that tech is not neutral and see where your development goes, and then you'll be ready to put it out the door. Just flip that paradigm and see how it would be different.
Open up to the rest of the panel. Anybody have thoughts about I think this question came up a couple of times about metrics, about how to judge our progress on these things.
I think as long as we go with what I think Tim O'Reilly has called the Wall Street algorithm, which basically operates, fuels, not just the platform companies, but we tend to forget and overlook the hundreds and thousands of data brokers and people who are busily putting together, assembling profiles about us, trying to figure out ways to extract their nickels and dimes off of all the data feeds they can get from the platforms and many other sources. So it is a very big ecosystem, not just a few players we tend to point to at the outset, but they're all based on an existing paradigm of capitalism, and the capitalism that even after the Business Roundtable last fall hopefully clarified for many of us that it's not just about short-term shareholder value. Imagine that, it's actually other stakeholders, including things like the environment. So I think if we can have a more expansive vision of what capitalism, what marketplaces are supposed to do for us, then maybe that's a way that we can hopefully engineer our way to some more hopeful futures with better metrics than just simply how many clicks can get me how many dollar bills out of this particular person.
Yeah. I always tell companies that the value of diversity isn't just that it helps you develop better solutions, it helps you ask better questions. And things you would have never thought of before. And so it's as much as Francella was talking about diversity of experience as other types of diversity. One of the things that I like to think about, and many people are surprised about, do you know if you were to do a search for female CEO in image search, I think they fixed this now, but do you know the image that would come up number one most of the time? Oh, they did fix it, but this was for a while. CEO Barbie. So it's not just about looking at that result, it's about asking questions about how did we get there.
I have to add something because I'm just thinking carefully about what's worth sharing on some of these conversations about diversity, because I do work with tech companies and encourage them constantly to open up their circles on whose opinions they value, who they're asking for input, and really about addressing the problem of not asking for input when a product is in its final stages and you're ready to push it out the door and you're just asking for some group from an underrepresented community to essentially bless it before it goes to market. And I think that it's really important that some of those demands mean that we have to vote with our dollars to actually say that we're not going to support companies that don't. If you say you value diversity, then what does your senior leadership team look like? What does your board of directors look like? Who are the organizations that you're supporting? Those are really important questions. I think that even when we're talking about our policymakers, it's really important that we have a diversity of people who are actually getting to put input on things that actually get reduced into either regulations or law. And I think that the truth is that that circle of people who gets to put in, it's very small. And the truth of the matter is, if we really wanted to expand that circle, we can support work from underrepresented voices. We can find ways to do it in terms of supporting their writing, by doing grants, by hiring outside of your circle, not just the people that you're friends with. There are lots of ways that we can do it, but it's hard for me when I fly to Silicon Valley for an event and everybody tells me that they value diversity, and the truth of the matter is, if we can find a way to put Wi-Fi in outer space, I mean, we can find a way to do a whole lot of things that we're not doing right now.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions with the admonition. We're running close on time, so please keep your questions short. I'll follow Margot's template and tee up three. I see one in the back there, and then two down here in front.
Baron Soka, is this on?
Yeah.
Baron Soka, Tech Freedom. So we can all applaud that the image that shows up is no longer Barbie in that example. But the flip side of that is you could just as easily imagine people saying that Google should have fixed it when the search result that came up for miserable failure was George W. Bush. I mean, I'm very disturbed by this suggestion that we should have companies fix results to produce things that we want, because of course the other side is going to do that too. So isn't there something to be said for just letting Google do its thing, which is to reflect the way that the web works, and not to try to get into these culture wars about what the right result would be, given that we already know that the people on this stage are not the only people who are going to be part of that debate, that the crazy Trumpist right is going to have exactly the same flip side demands about what they think it would mean to to fix results and to create an internet that reflects their values.
All right, great. And then we'll come down right here.
Hi, I guess this question is for Britton. You had a personal horrible experience with technology, and I noticed that you still have a Twitter handle up on the program. So why, I mean, a perfectly rational response would be to retreat from technology, right? And just not be public and not be out there. So why are you still out there and trying, and what sort of strategies or approaches do you take to maximize your impact for positive things and minimize that risk of negative feedback?
Hi, I work in California, so my question is about the CCPA and specifically the comment you made about consent fatigue. And so how do you reconcile that consent fatigue with what our legislators say, you know, our consumers are outraged about privacy? Do they view it as a problem, but it's not a problem that's really worth fixing?
Okay, so let me turn to the panel, our three questions. One about the contestability of fixes as we think about solutions. Are we going to run into some of the same issues that led to the problems and our way out of them? Britton, only if you're so inclined, your thoughts about continuing to use social media, and then this question about consent fatigue. Dave?
Oh, sorry. I was expecting Britton to take all of the questions.
Yeah, I don't want to take them all.
Totally unfair.
Sorry, which one was for me again?
How about this contestability of fixes question?
I mean, so this is quite a bit outside my area in terms of how you fix, you know, I mean, I don't necessarily deal that much with the consumer side of things and what people search. And in fact, I was waiting for you to call me on the when you tell a tech company when things are ready to go public, and I was saying I'm like, when it's surveillance technologies, I'm never going to tell you that it's okay to do it. Yeah, I don't know. This is a really difficult question that I don't necessarily know enough about to give a good answer on, I'm afraid.
I'll open it up to the rest of the panel. Fran.
And for me, I guess the way that the question was phrased was that the idea that you said on the flip side, like the opposite side, that I can't remember, the crazy Trumpist, whatever. I'm not on the opposite side of any of that, and I think that companies should be able to run platforms with a certain amount of autonomy. I think that the truth is that conversations with groups who are able to actually go and say, hey, did you see what's coming up when we do this search? Or, hey, did you realize that you guys are promoting X over Y? I think that those are healthy conversations. And I think that the truth is that, you know, we're in a place where essentially the market is regulating itself because, you know, Congress really just is not going to be able to keep up with the speed of innovation. And so the truth is, I don't even think that whatever legislative proposals there are going to be able to fix what we're talking about. I think they're only really there to help reinforce structures of accountability. But the truth is, we're going to have lots of ongoing conversations about the digital ecosystem that we want to create, because this certainly is not going to be a process where we get there and we say that we're done. There are going to be lots of new issues that appear in years to come.
Richard, I'll turn to you on both of the contestability
Yeah, actually, I'll
questions.
just address the last one on the consent fatigue issue. I think it's a very important opener, right? I think we need to have the ability to have consent when we are part of these platforms. But it should not be the end of the game. It should be just the beginning of the conversation. Such of the cognitive overload that's being pushed on us, again, with great irony, this notion that users are more in charge, you're more in control, just go to this dashboard and click on these 37 things and check them every day and you're all fine. None of us do this. Very few of us do that. And so one, I think, glimmer of hope is there's a piece of legislation that was introduced in the fall called the Access Act in the U.S. Congress. So this is Senators Warner, Blumenthal, and Hawley. And there they talk about, among other things, this right to have sort of interfaces to allow you to have portability for your data, interoperability, but also a term called delegability, which is the ability to delegate to a trusted third-party custodian these kinds of decisions, operating under fiduciary duties to you as a client. Again, not as a user, not as a consumer even, but as a client of their business. And that they recognize that this could be one way to sort of take some of that cognitive overload off of the individual, give them more of a chance for an agent that can represent them in a real life sense, online and offline. So I feel like that is a potential pathway worth exploring. And
the 20-second version of it, because time is up, Sometimes leadership means using your emphatic no. And the point of people harassing others online or taking online violence to offline forums is to try to remove their ability to meaningfully respond. And so I am in a position where people will listen to me, and I have an obligation to engage.
Well, on that note, we will come back at 1 o'clock with Casey Fiesler, Patty Limerick, Carl Schroeder, and Phil Weiser. It's now time for lunch, but before we go, let me admonish everyone, please say hello to students. Part of the admission coming in today is to introduce yourself, tell them about what you're doing, answer their questions. Can I get all the students in the room to raise their hands? So, if you are not a student, it is your job to track down one of the folks raising their hand and have a conversation with them. In the meantime, please join me in thanking our panel for the wonderful conversation.